What's up guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to make a live edge bench with a floating top. And if you shorten the legs up a bit, this would make a perfect coffee table. So let's get started. The first thing you're going to need is a live edge slab. I was lucky enough to have a friend who could give me a few live edge maple slabs he had lying around from an old tree he cut down. Slabs can get quite expensive, but if you look on used websites like Craigslist or Kijijis, you would definitely be able to find some pretty cheap. There are a few things you should look for when purchasing a slab. The thicker it is, the better. You're going to be removing material, so 2 to 3 inches would be ideal. The one I have started at 2 inches, and it was just above 1 inch when I finished flattening. The second thing you should look for is making sure that it's flat as possible. The more twisted or warped the board is, the more material you're going to have to take off of both sides to make them perfectly parallel. The slab I'm using, I've already flattened. You can find a link to a video on how I flatten my slabs using a router sled I made for less than 10 bucks. I'll leave a link at the end of the video as well as in the description so you guys can check it out later. I went through a few different designs before I settled upon one. First I went in 3x3 rectangle legs, but on something only 12.5 inches wide, I figured this would be kind of boxy looking. So I took away one of the 2x4s and made a 1.5 by 3 inch rectangle. This looked a little better, but I wasn't really happy with it. Then I figured I would add a simple X pattern in the middle of them, kind of like the old farmhouse style coffee tables. The cool thing about this build is that most of what I used came from scrap cut-offs of 2x4s I had lying around the garage. I cut 4 pieces of 2x4 to 16.5 inches and 4 pieces to 9.5 inches. Those would make up the rectangles for the legs. Then I cut 2 2x4s to 17 inches. I'll use them later to make the X in the center of the legs. Over at the table saw, I took the rounded edges off the 2x4s, cutting them down to 3 inches wide. Then I cut the two 17-inch pieces in half. First taking the rounded edges off and then slicing it down the middle, basically making my own 2x2s. Now it's time to take these and turn it into this. I first worked on the outside box part of the leg. I drilled a 1/2 inch recess into the leg, put some wood glue on the wood, and then screwed it together. Using screws means that I can keep working without having to wait for the glue to dry. Once it was all done, I'd come back and plug the holes with dowels anyways. So basically rinse and repeat till the rectangle is done. As for the cross on the inside, I laid the box on top of one of the 2x2s and drew the cuts where I needed to make it fit in diagonally. I made all those cuts on the miter saw. Once I had the first part of the X cut out, I could lay it in and mark where I needed to cut the second piece. I decided to cut it in half instead of doing some fancy half lap joint. No real reason other than it's simpler and it takes less time. So with the second pieces cut, I could place them into the leg assembly. Once I had it positioned just right, I put a screw in to hold it in place. I didn't use any glue for the middle part, as they don't really have any structural value whatsoever. I decided to make the length of the bench 4 feet, and I wanted the legs to be offset from the end by 2 inches. So I decided to make a stretcher that would run underneath the bench top but above the legs and not be visible. This gives the bench more strength and it will give me something to attach the top to later. It will also give the bench that floating top look I'm going for. I took a scrap 2x4 and 2x6 I had laying around and cut them both to 44 inches long. Then I planed them down to just under 3/4 inches thickness. I wanted the bench top to be floating about 1/2 inch above the legs, but as I started to plane those boards thinner and thinner, they started to get flimsy, so I stopped just before 1/2 inch. The last step before staining was to fill the holes with the dowels and then give the legs a nice quick sand. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss any spots at all. It's really difficult to get the stain into the thin cracks of the X joinery, and even harder to wipe away the excess before it dries up. It ended up taking about 25 minutes per leg. It was worth it, but if I had to do it again, I might stain most of it before screwing it all together, just to save myself a bit of trouble. The top received 2 coats of Varathane's triple thick water-based polyurethane and satin. The next morning it received a 3rd coat, while the legs got a coat of their own. Once it was all dry, I wet sanded the top and the legs with 600 grit. Then I went back and hit the top with 120 grit paper. Now that the finishing work was done, all I had left was assembly. Once confident with all the positioning of the parts, I could glue and screw the stringers onto the top of the legs. Funny enough, I ended up getting the legs backwards. Left was in the right spot and right was in the left spot. No worries though, as I caught it before I went too far. And just so we're clear, from a building standpoint the legs are the same. But there's certain characteristics in the wood that I wanted to show off on the outside of the legs, hence they needed to be oriented a certain way. So I glued and screwed the stringers onto the tops of the legs. Since the bench had a curve in it, it would be more possible to see these stringers from the front, so I mounted them towards the back, leaving a ½ inch gap. Then it was time to attach the top. I figured glue would be the way to go. Lots and lots of glue. Once I felt like I had enough glue, I added a little more. Then I centered the bench to the top. I didn't want to leave any clamp marks, so I used scrap wood between the clamps and the bench. This is something you don't want to skip, as denting your project can suck, especially when you're so close to finishing. I clamped this thing so hard together that glue was actually squeezing out of the knots from the bottom of the table. Check this out, it's kinda cool. I ended up spending like 20 minutes just sitting there wiping the glue off until it stopped running out of the knot. After waiting a day for the glue to fully cure, I removed the clamps and sanded the top one final time with 120 grit sandpaper. And then it was done. I'm totally in love with this bench. I've had the piece of wood sitting in my apartment now for a few months and never knew really what to do with it. I think this was the perfect application. The floating top is really a unique feature. I think the color of the top, with the live edge, and the fact that it's got a small curve in it, really complement the rustic farmhouse style legs. We're one step closer to achieving that glass-like appearance. If you guys like what you saw, feel free to subscribe. I put out videos weekly. Also, hit that thumbs up button or leave a comment. It really helps out a small, growing channel like mine. Thanks for watching.